One thing's for sure, when you talk about games that made a lasting impact on both the Game Boy and Game Boy Color handhelds and the games market at the time, it's Pokémon. While there are hairs to split around what already existed in gaming and what Pokémon brought to the formula when it came out, it's undeniable that the idea of taking a special item and risking it to capture a bunch of little goobers shook up the Game Boy's ecosystem like nothing else had. Trading, battling, collecting, evolving, split version releases, that's what this series will be looking into. And yes, I said series. By my count, there's somewhere in the approximate area of about 40 or so of these games, spread across a decade of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color lifespans. Each video will cover a batch of games chronologically, right up until the end. Some years were super heavy with these types of games, and some years didn't have any. But quite a few of the titles over the course of this project have been dug up by fans of this genre and given long overdue translations. I'll be mentioning where you can find those if they exist. However, it should still be expected that any of these games that came out without an original English release will require some real dedicated translation work to get through. The nature of these types of games usually being turn-based RPGs or strategy games, and usually heavy on story, menus, text information, means that even a simpler one could be a lot to get through if you aren't prepared for the slow task of translating it for yourself as you go. Oh, and before I forget, I mentioned in the Digital Pet video that I had acquired some equipment to capture via original hardware now. Specifically, a Game Boy Pocket, my favorite model of Game Boy, and a GB Interceptor for direct recording. You might notice that the gameplay sections look a little different. I'll keep working on it and evolving it as things go, so please do bear with me. But if you love it, let me know in the comments, and be sure to swing by my Twitch streams to see everything in action live. It's a fun time when, everything actually works as intended. Alright, Game Boy, I've had enough. Enough of this, I say. I just want to play Kirby Pinball. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the first leg of this monster-catching journey, but not with Pokémon. No, there's something... Well, it's more like a few somethings that I feel really count as the earliest games on the Game Boy that fit this categorization. For them, we've got to go all the way back to December of 1992. So there's going to be some odd timey-wimey stuff going on with our first game. Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible was released in Japan the first time as an original Game Boy cartridge on December 23, 1992. It was then released in Japan again as a black Game Boy Color dual cart 7 years later in March of '99, but that's not all. The dual cart upgrade version was also given its own English translation and released as Revelations: The Demon Slayer in North America that August of the same year. There's no major differences between the Japanese and North American releases of the game, so if we could all just collectively roll our eyes and move past the sprite censorship that the English version went through, then this Revelations: The Demon Slayer footage that I'm using will do us just fine. There's also restoration patches and translations for the original game if that's something you're interested in, like I was. Now, I'm not overly familiar with the Megami Tensei franchise, having never played a Persona game or any of the Shin Megami Tensei games, but my understanding is that a major mechanical through line of most of these games is that you're able to talk with demons and monsters in an attempt to persuade them into joining your party. Then you can fuse the monsters together into new ones, and this helps to pass on skills, improve stats, etc. Since the monster party members themselves don't usually level up in the same way that your main human characters do. The bones of this mechanic get carried over to the Game Boy entry, but it's all been pared down to only a handful of conversation threads and no real ways to make the process any quicker or easier, at least when you first start out. Going in blind and simply trying to puzzle my way through multiple conversations with zero success, it wasn't particularly fun or engaging to deal with in this implementation for a good while in the beginning. Let me take a moment here to say that while there's an abundance of Q&A threads, fan guides, and manual scans for this particular game that are out there, that's not always the case with older games like this, and it certainly won't be for a lot of the games that I go through for this series. I prefer to try and figure things out for myself, maybe with a manual if I can find one, and I only really consult any available guides or walkthroughs if I really get stuck or things just aren't making any sense at all. No shade to anyone that prefers to have as much open information as possible when playing, but that's just not for me. After reading through a scan of the original manual for Revelations the Demon Slayer, I learned that there are some general guidelines that you can follow that help you have an easier time with the recruiting. It's things like how monsters with healing magic are usually kind-hearted and respond well to the nicer dialogue options, or how the other human party members might have better success with monsters that are higher or lower in strength than you are. This does make the process a bit less frustrating, knowing that there's actually a few ways to figure out an optimal conversation path, but without knowing any of that ahead of time can really make the monster recruiting a bunch of unfun, repetitive dialogues that I'm sure it wasn't really intended to be. Things do iron out once you successfully manage to recruit some monsters to your party and you use them to recruit their kin for you, but it's not until you get the party member with a special combined magic that the game really picks up. Fusing the monsters makes the game much more manageable. Unfortunately though, the problems don't really end there, but I honestly think most of the flaws are really just a product of this being an old game and an old RPG specifically, especially with it being fairly early in the original Game Boy's life cycle. Perhaps the devs here just weren't as confident with how much they thought they could squeeze out of the system yet. Whatever the reason, there's a lot of trappings attached to these early days of RPG development that can kind of bog things down for me in a game like this, and they definitely do in this game. Things just sort of start with the intro NPC handing you some money and a cheap sword before you're set free to wander to your heart's content. If you want to go get yourself destroyed in combat by walking right into a higher level area early on, go ahead. Need consumable items? Hope you can figure out which ones do what before you buy them, because you can only hold a few at a time. It's not just monster recruiting conversations you'll need to be having either, as your only hints and directions for where you might need to go next are scattered around with NPCs inhabiting the various towns and special locations. Like I said though, this is just old RPG stuff, and whether or not you gel with that or find it too tedious to suffer through is more of a personal preference than an outright problem with the game's presentation. I suppose the bottom line for this first stop on our Monster Party journey here is that whether it's Revelations the Demon Slayer or Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible that you choose, this game has great monster sprites, a real solid soundtrack, but your enjoyment of this game's combat, story progression, and that all-important monster recruiting mechanic will depend on how much vintage RPG you can tolerate. But this wasn't the only game in this series on the Game Boy, so let's see if it got better in the following year. Wow. Talk about an upgrade. Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible 2 was released less than a full year after the first game, coming out in November of 1993. But it does so much to build up and improve the original formula that it's exactly what you want from a sequel. It takes everything from the first game, and makes it easier to get through, more enjoyable to engage with, and fills it with secrets and mystery right from the start. This one also got the Game Boy Color re-release treatment, but it never got the same official English release like the last time. At least there's an English fan translation for this one though, courtesy of Esper Knight over at romhacking.net. If you've played the first game, then everything here should be familiar. You name your character, grab some starting gear, wander off toward the next town, and do a real number on the local beast population as you go. The strings of conversation that you can have with the beasts are here too, but they felt much more natural to navigate and had a higher degree of success. I added a monster to my party in my very first combat encounter, and there were only a few times while I played that I really felt peeved that I couldn't get a monster to join me, seemingly no matter what I tried. As an interesting bonus, you can also use conversations that are successful with the enemy to earn a little extra cash, or potentially even a rare item. There's also a day or night cycle that affects the likelihood that the beasts will even talk to you at all now. Same as before though, only your human party members level up and gain new stats and skills, with the monsters being mostly locked into the levels you recruited them at. You can still fuse them together into new forms, but you do so without the restrictions locking you down like in the first game. You can't create the ultimate life form with a pile of low-level beasts or anything like that, but you can easily fuse monsters together into something that you won't even fight as an enemy for another area or two ahead of yourself. And as a bonus, if you do end up with one of those newer monsters, that has the potential to make it easier to recruit more of them in future encounters if you need another one for fusion materials later. Beyond these usual ways to interact with your beast party members, there's also opportunities here to do things like leave one of them to protect a village of pixies in distress, or to stay and train itself to grow stronger. These same party members can now even hold items for you, increasing the overall amount of storage space in your party, even if they can't use most of them for anything themselves. All of these more personifying touches to the otherwise interchangeable beast members on your team really help to sell the idea that the world of this game is one where the beasts aren't just fodder to grind for experience and money. Which is kind of strange, considering that's pretty much all you do for the entire game. I don't know, maybe it wraps up nicer after I stopped playing. I don't really have much to say in the negative for this one when compared to its predecessor, honestly. I wasn't thrilled with the spell names not being intuitive at all, and not having a way to read about what they did before using them without consulting an online walkthrough was a little annoying. And I guess it's a toss-up on which of the two games had the soundtrack I like better, but all of that's pretty nitpicky really. There's way more good here for me than there was bad. The sprites are really detailed and have a great range of interesting designs again. I never felt overwhelmed by enemies far stronger than my current abilities. The grind never set in too bad. Plus, there were even secret caves with treasure inside and optional combat areas with their own mini-bosses to deal with. All of it just hidden away and discovered with a little wandering around the map or talking to the local NPCs. It was really quite refreshing to have such a solid and enjoyable time with this one after the early game struggle that marred the first game. Everything moved at a good clip, with new things to see, and as much technical complexity to the standard turn-based combat as you really wanted to give the game. This is a game that I'll definitely be playing more of and exploring more on my own beyond this project. I wouldn't go as far as to say that there's no reason to play the first game, but the sequel is the clear winner. Play both if you're interested in the overarching story and how it all ties together into the greater lore of the Megami Tensei universe, but just know that the first Last Bible is going to be clunkier and have a much slower start. Still though, that's what made me appreciate Last Bible 2 that much more. I could see how things that made the first game interesting were fixed up and given more purpose here, but I know that approach isn't for everybody, so I suppose you have my permission to skip the first game and go right to Last Bible 2 if you need to. I won't judge. As long as you consider giving this game a try, we'll call it negotiation successful. The final Megami Tensei game on the Game Boy wasn't a direct sequel to the first two, but still falls in line with that overarching humans and beasts fighting to coexist storyline that they all follow. Titled Another Bible, it released in Japan in March of 1995 and was a pretty stark departure from the turn-based RPG format of those earlier two games. It never made its way west, but it did get an English fan translation way back in the early 2000s, which is always nice to see. Credit to that patch goes to Aeon Genesis over on romhacking.net. What primarily sets this game apart from the others in the Game Boy trilogy is that, unlike the two last Bible games, here in Another Bible, you're playing a strategy RPG instead of a more classic first-person battle view style RPG. You have a party of companions, including one that can convince monsters over to your side as a special action, and you play out different chapters of the game's story across different locations. There's very little managing of equipment in Another Bible, no conversations with the monsters, and no overworld map to wander around at your leisure. Instead, you're dropped right into your first fight from the start, and the game moves from combat location to a recovery town section with NPCs and a shop, then on to the next combat location. There's not even a pause menu or buttons to access an inventory or save screen while you're in towns, only during the combat encounters. This threw me off a lot at first, especially since there are options to add equipable items to party members before an encounter section begins, but you hardly have anywhere to buy or find those items for a while. It was even more confusing when I realized that the monsters you recruit to your side actually do gain experience points in combat here, and they can even level up and learn new skills on top of being given those equipable items. Actually, more differentiation here from the last Bible games, as there's no monster fusing in this one either. Your monster party members gain their levels, and once they reach a certain point, they'll actually change forms to a stronger monster, which kind of makes this a bit more like a Pokemon game than the originals. And Pokemon wasn't even out for almost another year after Another Bible. Neat. Anyway, as someone who's not a huge strategy RPG fan, I have to say that I enjoyed this one pretty well. It definitely embraces what makes the Game Boy a favorite platform of mine in the first place, which is to say that it's a distillation of the core components of a game genre made to be able to play in short bursts. You have plenty of opportunities to save before every round of combat, and you can wrap up a session for a bit, then come back without really losing your footing too bad. Most everything is explained, even if a bit imperfectly, and it makes the whole package a lot easier to play through. One of my only real complaints here is that the game can get really slow during some of the more packed combat scenarios. While you're able to bring a full squad of 10 party members with you into combat, once you have that many characters to use anyway, the game will sometimes throw nearly twice that many enemies on the map for you to deal with. And this might just be a general strategy game thing that I'm not fond of, but waiting for all of the turns to wrap up, especially when the game is physically struggling due to so many things on screen at once, is pretty rough. Even though you don't have to fight all the enemies depending on the situation, and you might only need to take out a commanding unit or locate a special item and scram, there's a monetary bonus in it for you if you do a full clear of each location's enemies, so sometimes it really does pay to do so. Not to mention that your own units only get worthwhile amounts of experience in combat by being the unit to actually defeat an enemy. There's a lot of fiddly experience bonuses that you can receive, actually, for using things like magic or doing an attack in the first place, but it's literally a single point of experience for these things most of the time, which makes defeating the enemies the only reliable way to level up your party. I have a feeling this is definitely just a strategy game thing that I don't personally enjoy, but I found myself having to take extra turns in some early scenarios just to maneuver my weaker party members into positions that would net them an easy score on an enemy. This would regularly stretch encounters out way longer than I wanted to sit with them, and I would end most of them with a handful of units just stalling their turns out while the rest cleaned up and moved on. Overall, I would still recommend this game, especially if you're a fan of this particular monster recruitment style of the subgenre. But similarly to my disclaimer about Last Bible 1, it really depends on how much vintage RPG you're able to stomach. If you're into light strategy RPGs and you have an interest in or are already a fan of the Megami Tensei DNA, I would recommend you try it out just to see if it clicks with you. If you are devoid of patience though, or you feel like this is too far off base for what you want in a monster catching game, then I wouldn't blame you for sitting this one out. Let's be real here. If you came to this video, this one right now, about games where you put monsters on a team and battle them against each other, you know what Pokemon is. Maybe you didn't play the original games on the Game Boy. You might even have come here not already knowing that the red and green versions came out first, then blue version, before spreading anywhere else. Maybe. And who am I to judge if that actually is the case? Pokemon Red and Green came out in Japan in February 1996, followed by Blue version in October that same year, and Yellow version in September of 1998. None of the Pokemon games came to the US or anywhere else until 1998 and 99, with Pokemon Yellow actually being one of the last non-Game Boy Color cartridges produced at that time. Side note, I don't know what happened in 1997, but it was the only year without a single release I could find that fit on this list. Lots of Game Boy digital pet games, since Tamagotchi came out in June of 97, as well as the first entries in the Game Boy Metabots line, but neither of those qualify for this list, so, pour one out for the year 1997, I guess. Anyway, you know what made Pokemon the driving force of this subgenre of RPG. You take a ball, you toss it out, you put a little goober in it, and then you spend the game watching various forms of goober set each other on fire, or sing, or shock, or poison each other into submission. I don't know about you, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't grab me by the brain as a kid, and I was never the same again. These original games are still popular all this time later for a reason. They've sold copies at a combined total in the tens of millions. Red and Blue version have the most submitted speedruns and highest total player count of any original Game Boy game on speedrun.com as of this video being researched. Representatives for the first 151 Pokemon are included in basically every related project that comes out. It's a long legacy, but I don't personally find them very fun to play. Anymore, anyway. Look, I'm desperately enamored with the sprite work in these games. Some of them are hilarious, some of them are adorable, but they all have a special place in my heart. And I will say that the formula here is exactly what it needs to be. I sure do love catching the goobers in the balls and watching them fight until they evolve into Gooberzards and Goobersaurs. But if you would look me in the eye and try to convince me that fully evolved Pokemon with their levels in the 50s, learning moves like Leer, is good game design, we are not on the same wavelength, my friend. Move representation is trash across all of the original types, really. The wild encounter tables are just plain awful. Everything takes 3 times as long as it should in these games. But that's why I tried my hand at ROM hacking Pokemon Yellow a while back. I know, right? I slogged through almost 20 hours to get through that game several months ago, and I was so disappointed with how it went, I looked into fixing the issues that I had with it myself. It went pretty okay, apart from the odd graphical issue, and I was able to add in things like a gender selection, some custom sprites, new areas, new Pokemon, and rebalanced a lot of the movesets and wild tables. Thank you so much to the Pret project for the disassembly on that. I never finished or released the hack, but I ended up learning a lot about the inner workings of the original Pokemon games, and it really left me wondering, even more than before, why the original developers had made what seemed like such obviously fixable decisions. But isn't that what any fan who's passionate about something they love would say? I know what went wrong, let me fix it. As a game developer myself, I'm sure I make all kinds of decisions in my games that the people who play them would love me to fix up and make align more with their particular tastes. And maybe someday, a game of mine will mean enough to someone that they try to add to it or remake it in their own image. Who can say, you know? No matter what I might think of these first 4 Pokemon games all these years later, or what I find myself wanting to do to them to make them feel now more like how I thought they felt when I was a kid, you can't deny that they deserve their place as the origin point for this project. Whether you play them or not is something I can only really leave up to you. If I had to steer you one direction or the other though, honestly, unless you're curious because you've never played these original games before, I would say you're better off with Fire Red, Leaf Green, or one of the 2 Let's Go games over these. Having had all of 1997 to percolate, I suppose, the first in the storm of immediate Pokemon followers comes to us from another of the world's most highly marketable franchises, Sanrio. That's right, Sanrio Timenet Kako-Hen and Mirai-Hen, past and future editions respectively, released as split games, just like Pokemon, in November of 1998, and both feature recognizable characters like My Melody, Bad Bad's Maru, and Karopi as helpful NPCs or opponents that you battle. Hello Kitty herself is even staffed as the nurse that heals your party of bodyguard monsters for you, a la Pokemon's own Nurse Joy. So right off the bat, I was heavily invested in whatever goobers were to be found in this game. And Sanrio Timenet does not disappoint. Not only do you have 3 completely different starting monsters to choose from based on which game you play, but every design in this game has the usual Sanrio design sensibilities, and I love it. I've always been a fan of their characters and aesthetic. What about this game, though? Well, it's kinda mixed. Probably on the lower end. In the beginning of the game, you're recruited by a mysterious email, given a handful of get cards to capture wild monsters. Then you're turned loose to get from location to location on your mission to catch enough little goobers to repair the Pillar of Time. Definitely nothing too unfamiliar or in-depth here, but you do get to pick your gender presentation, which is nice. Take that, Pokemon. Not long after the game lets you take over, though, you start to notice that there's sort of a lot of problems with Sanrio Timenet. Even with the early Pokemon games having recycled move pools that were horribly undertuned, they still offered way more than the monsters get here in these games. You'll be slugging it out in combat with a single move doled out to every monster you add to your team for quite a while. Eventually, you'll start finding skill items you can equip to give your monsters new moves, but it barely puts a dent in the repetitive back and forth of combat encounters. And even though the monsters, lots of them anyway, do evolve into more powerful forms at higher levels, the bulk of the experience grind is more slow going than it really has any right to be. To top it all off, instead of every move holding its own stock of uses, all monsters have a supply of magical power their moves tap into. If you run out of this energy, you can still use your monster's moves, but each one now takes a similar amount of health from your monster instead. Another problem is that there's not really any safe places to be during the game. as pretty much all the walkable areas you encounter are active with wild enemies. And while it's easy enough to heal your party back at the Hello Kitty nurse stations that are dotted around, God save you if your last monster runs out of HP, because there is no gentle wipe for you here, my friends. It's straight to a game over and a reset, so it's best to be generous with the save function. And unlike Pokemon, it's not as easy to stock up on healing and preventative items to get you through a lot of the map locations, since money is scarce, and the environments are pretty large and mostly empty. It's way too easy to find yourself aimlessly wandering as your party runs out of energy and HP. Not to mention that this is another game that plants very deliberate difficulty spikes in areas accessible right from the start. It's hard enough to run from fights at the best of times here, but it's even worse when you're standing opposite an enemy more than half a dozen levels higher than your strongest monster. One interesting thing I'll give this game is when you get into a battle with an NPC and defeat their team of bodyguard monsters, you're presented with the chance to claim one of their defeated monsters for your own team. The idea of taking one of your defeated opponent's own monsters for yourself isn't something that's ever really in any games in this subgenre, so it was interesting to see here for sure. It's a novel way to give players a chance to get a rare or unique monster for their own team, or just to pad their collection's number. I did appreciate that, even if a lot of the NPC monsters I was offered were ones that I already had collected or seen before. I think the bottom line for me and Sanrio Timenet is that it feels simultaneously too simple and too complicated. I do think that, given more time to figure things out on my own, and especially with help from a manual and no time constraints, I might like it a bit more than I currently do. But especially with there being no real guide or translation help for this one, it's difficult to get through and more difficult to recommend than I'd like it to be. Sorry, Hello Kitty fans. Being easily one of the most well-known Pokemon competitors of its time, the Robopon series really doesn't deserve to be in that shadow. Apart from having a similar plot structure that sees your young protagonist challenging a league of professional battlers, and the obvious catching things in special objects, Robopon sets itself pretty far apart. Not only does it do so many things different with the usual formula, but it packs so much into itself, it's hard to even cover it properly in a project like this. But I'll give it my best shot. Ponkottsu SUN and Star versions came out in December of 1998 in that split release just like we were already used to by now. Shortened to Robopon, the full title translates to something like Robot Junk, which makes a lot of sense considering many of the robot designs in this game are very scrappy, walking screws and bolts type stuff. You wake up one morning to noise in your backyard and your parents leaving for work and errands. So you go outside to visit your scientist grandpa, which the digital pet video really laid down that there are a lot of scientist grandpas in these early Game Boy games. He promptly bestows his entire robot research company and its substantial debts onto you. You get his newest Robopon, a small cash stipend, and it's off to the races with you, and that's when Robopon really shows just how much is under its hood. Even before leaving your grandpa's company building, you can explore to find a basement level with a carpenter for hire waiting inside. Pay him, and he'll add new floors to the building, giving you access to an item shop, parts shop, and more, all right at your home base. There's also hidden items all over the place in this starting town, so it's good to dig in the corners of the buildings before you leave. Once you make your way to the gates leaving town though, they're blocked by your first combat encounters. Chalk up another difference here, in that a lot of these encounters with battle-ready NPCs, you're given the option to say no. No line-of-sight dodging required here. Combat is deceptively similar to Pokémon, I think. You are still fighting any opposing robots one-on-one, cycling through yours and their teams of bots, but there's a lot that goes into the combat that you wouldn't necessarily see without having played it for yourself. You choose from a similar list of options to what you'd expect, although there is an evade option here now, but the attacks that your robots can use on their turns are based on their parts makeup and their installed software, all of which are handled by you outside of encounters. Robots can be caught or bought, upgraded and evolved, and all of this is mixed with swappable parts and multiple types and levels of attack software. Further still, depending on what kind of software and parts you've paired together on a given bot, they might gain access to upgraded combination skills that really set you up for an easier time in fights. Overlay a system of status effects and type advantages on this combat, and things here feel very satisfying to learn and experiment with. The capturing mechanic built into the encounters is pretty standard, just using magnets to attempt to pull a weakened robot to your side, which works because they're robots. But a nice touch is that you can find more magnets and other consumables as combat drops from enemies, again, because they're robots. This is really appreciated because while it's not a guarantee that a defeated bot will drop anything when you need them to, it's still useful to help keep you stocked up on the minor necessities like cheap magnets and basic healing items. And those types of goods are kept with their prices low in local shops, making it easy to stock up, but it's a welcome touch that makes sense in the context of junky robots dropping scraps when they lose. One last thing that I want to touch on has to do with the game's physical cartridge. Its extended shell that sticks out of the back of any Game Boy you put it in houses an infrared receiver inside. It's not used for a ton of things in most games, but in Robopon it's certainly put to more use than some other carts with a similar GB Kiss style infrared feature. It lets you trade robots with another player's game, helps open special chests hidden around, and it even helps power your bots up in the late game. I will never not love implementations of technology like this. Being able to point a television remote at my Game Boy game just to push a button and get a random item from an otherwise locked chest is funny, creative, superfluous, and just so good. Easily one of the reasons that this game is still a treasure in its physical form. Robopon Sun has a very low barrier to entry, having gotten its own official English release back in the day, but even its partnered Star version had its English translation uncovered recently as well. And while there are plenty of similarities to Pokémon here, Robopon, though, really feels like it tried to take the familiar, positive bits from Pokémon and build on them to make something all its own. Something that I really think any fans of these types of games should give a try sometime. Similarly to Robopon just before it, this next game continues to prove that even in the early days, the monster-catching subgenre that Pokémon exploded in popularity still had plenty of breadth and depth to explore. Kaseki Sousei Reborn came out in July of 1998 and is more of a beginner-level mystery dungeon game than a standard Pokémon game. If you've never played a game like this before, what I mean by a mystery dungeon game is that it's cut from the same cloth as other games like Shiren the Wanderer or Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon. These are games where you're wandering around dungeon maps with enemies moving simultaneously, and you do combat with them in semi-real time, with every action getting a reaction from any nearby units, friend or foe. Pokémon even has their own games of this type in the aptly titled Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series. While I'm not a fan of the usually brutal difficulty and micromanaging that can come with games of this type, Kaseki Sousei Reborn is much more forgiving and far less involved than your average mystery dungeon. There's no permanent character death here, or really any punishment for having a party wipe in the caves you're exploring. Believe it or not, I actually had to spend quite a bit of time after I stopped gathering footage for this one just to test, to see what it would take to even get a full wipeout. When your little fossil goobers fall in combat here, as long as at least one of them finishes the fight and wins, the rest of them come back with a single HP, ready to be healed up for more. And even if you do get that full and unfortunate wipeout, you just pop back up above the ground and have to go heal your party for free at the appropriate building. No loss of items, money, experience points, none of that. As for how you assemble your own team of goobers in this game, well, that's actually pretty easy too. You just go into a cave, find some fossils, dig them up, bring them all back to the head doctor at his fossil reconstruction lab, and then you can cycle through your available fossils that you've collected, mixing and matching them to your heart's content. Once you settle on whichever silhouette that you think will spit out a good little goober for your 4-goober squadron, you just hit the button and it gets reborn. And there's some real great creature design here for these goobers too. Lots of bugs, living plants, adorable mascot types, very enjoyable array of goobers, for sure. And what you see is what you get too, because there's no evolution or upgrades for your fossil pals in Kaseki Sousei Reborn. They will learn new attacks as they level up, but that's about it. Despite my efforts with translation and research, I couldn't find any manual scans, FAQs, or any other resource that explained what the attacks that my creatures were learning actually did. I'm not sure if there's any sort of advantage system or anything else that would differentiate one attack from another, apart from increased damage or a shove that pushes enemy units back. That effect certainly comes in handy, even when the enemies are the ones using it on you, as it can give you a breather to heal up or even a chance to run away and use an escape item. It's not a lot of depth, to be sure, and there's basically nothing in terms of attack animations for the monsters, but when looking at this as an attempt of a very beginner-friendly mystery dungeon, I think it gets along just fine. Things move quick, and the monsters you can resurrect aren't exactly balanced once they're on your side, so if you get the right one or two together, you can power level them and steamroll just about anything except the bosses. One of my biggest issues with the game, honestly, is that the music is kinda lackluster, and I can usually excuse this in games of this era, but here the tracks you listen to are on repeat for such a long time as you comb through the same caves over and over. Even if I thought they were total bangers, there's only so long and so many times you can sit through those same loops before you start to get sick of them. In small doses, this might even be a pretty negligible issue, but for longer sittings, especially if you get stuck grinding or want to explore for enough fossils to make each of the different creatures so you can fill up your data album, which really calls back to Dino Breeder from the digital pet games, those songs and sounds will get pretty old. Also, while not a direct complaint, despite this being a pretty basic and beginner-friendly entry in the Mystery Dungeon style of game, the fact that it's a Japanese-only release with no hints of translation projects underway or anything else to help understand it better does make it a bit harder to recommend. Do I, personally, like it and think it's worth some time to play? Yes. Especially if the idea of digging up fossils and combining them into battle goobers appeals to you like it does to me. Do I think that many people would get enough out of the experience due to the language barrier? Not necessarily. But if you can manage to get through the intro okay, and you make some notes on things like what the common items do and what the button interactions are, there is a good time to be had with Kaseki Sousei Reborn. Just maybe not if you're a seasoned Mystery Dungeon fan looking for something to really sink your teeth into. Our last game for this first video in the series, Dragon Quest Monsters, released in September of 1998, and is an offshoot of the illustrious Dragon Quest series that started on the Famicom and NES back in the 1980s. If you were in the US playing any games in this series prior to 2002 though, you'd know them as Dragon Warrior, due to a pre-existing tabletop IP having claim over the Dragon Quest title until Square Enix registered it properly in the new millennium. Knowing that, the US release for this game, Dragon Warrior Monsters, is what I'll be going with for this section because the changes are just to the localized story, dialogue, and monster names, but let me just say, since this is the last game in this opening part of this project, it's about to get real untranslated real fast. Getting into the game anyway, the direct comparison here isn't to Pokémon, but more to the Megami Tensei Gaiden games from the very start of this list. You're not catching any of the monsters here, or having spirited debates with them, but simply tossing them snacks and hoping that by defeating them in combat last, it'll be enough to make them want to join you. There's all manner of goober here to bring over to your side, fledgling monster tamer that you are, and since you can breed monsters together after you reach a certain point in the game's story, you're able to have quite the menagerie going before too long. There's even an adorable monster farm where you can keep any monsters that you don't use to form your team, and it expands with the rest of the kingdom's locations as you play through the game. Before we move on from the subject of the monsters here though, let me just take a bit of time to say that few artists could draw a little goober like Akira Toriyama. If you didn't already know that his fingerprints were all over the Dragon Quest series, let me illuminate that for you now. I actually managed to get a copy of the V-Jump game guide for Dragon Quest Monsters, which is a book made for the special Shonen Jump kids spin-off line of magazines and game guides. They made a bunch of these books for all kinds of games with a focus on Square Enix titles of the day, and this one's just chock full of adorable illustrations that would fit right in with any other Toriyama works like Dragon Ball or Chrono Trigger. There's plenty of useful game information here, especially all of the maps and team compositions for the tournaments, but the real delight are all of the pieces of monster art and depictions of happenings in the game that have been drawn out for you to look at here. Just about everything in this game is adorable, but just as much of it is pretty explorable too. The maps are randomly generated each time you go through a portal, so you get a comfortably different run each time. Rarer items on the ground, wandering NPCs, and even special rooms can all show up during any journey through the monster portals, and that's something that really helps with the grind. While the selection of enemies will stay the same, knowing that there might be an extra tiny medal laying around on the ground, or that you might stumble into a room full of treasure chests, makes it much more enjoyable to go through the same maps over and over again while you train up your current monster team. Ultimately, you need to become tournament champion in this wild wonderland after all, so you have to make sure your goobers are in tip-top form for butt-kicking, especially since you don't do any of that butt-kicking yourself. Combat here is completely hands-off for your player character. No worries about equipment or anything like that either. Your team of 3 monsters all operate with just the stats they grow as they level up, and the skills they learn to use along with it. You can use items on your turn for things like healing your own monsters, or enticing enemies to be more willing to join you when the fight's over, but the actual combat part is almost as autonomous as you want it to be. There's no automatic combat feature in Dragon Warrior Monsters, but if you trust your team of goobers to do the right things on their own every combat turn, you can simply have them fight it out and make their own decisions. Otherwise, if you need to adjust things on the fly, or target a specific enemy before the others, you can choose that strategy from a list of 3 options, each of which changes the behavior of the monster in question. A more aggressive plan might see your monster scoring more critical hits due to extra physical effort, while a cautious plan is the best way to ensure a monster stays on the defensive and generously uses any healing magic it knows before things get too dicey. This is a really interesting and enjoyable slant to the otherwise regular turn-based combat on offer, and the tactics that you employ with your monster team will actually affect their future actions and temperaments as you go. But it's not enough to just keep a single team of well-trained goobers through the whole adventure, as monsters only have a certain limit to their natural stat growth and level cap. This means that no matter how much attachment you get to a monster, planning to use it to pass down its most beneficial skills or high-value stat pools is really key. Not only is it a great way to see more of the goobers that the game has on offer, but it helps keep your monsters fighting fit and kitted out with the best versions of their skills that they have access to. Plus, there are even some side quests that require specific monsters to be given to some of the NPCs to help them with tasks or show them a rare monster type. It really adds to the breadth and depth of the monster keeping in this one. I didn't get as deep into the game as I'd like to go with Dragon Warrior monsters, but it's easily also on my list of games to continue playing beyond this project. It's silly, charming, engaging, and it never felt quite as bogged down as games of this type can have a tendency to get. And while there's a sequel to this game on the horizon a couple videos down the line, I also found out that there's a remake that came out on the 3DS too, so I'll definitely be looking into that for myself. This one gets a big recommend from me to any other fans of this subgenre, and makes for a really nice checkpoint, I think, for this first leg of our journey to conclude on. Well, that about does it for this first video in the Game Boy monster catching, taming, party series that I've got going on here. The next part of the series will be on pretty much all of 1999. There's something like another dozen games just in 1999 to get to, and we'll be seeing some familiar faces, but there's a lot of original stuff in there too that I'm excited to talk about. And if you're excited to hear me talk about that, then I would love for you to do all the usual YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, and if you really like hearing me talk about it, then over on my Patreon is where I'll have a tier list video going up about this first leg of the monster catching whatever journey that we've all started on here right now. I would like to keep them as partner videos up over on my Patreon, which you can get to by going to patreon.com/astoryiinpieces. Thank you so much for making it all the way to the end here. I hope you're all ready for this series to continue, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.